Welcome to the loan pre-application meeting. My name is Charlie Parkins. I'm the grant loan supervisor for the grant and loan program. A couple of housekeeping items. This is being recorded. If you have questions during the chat or during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A session at the end so we can have plenty of time to discuss questions or whatever, but if you have them during the presentation, feel free to throw them in the chat. The slides are available. I believe they're pinned to the top, and they're also available on our website. Again, my name is Charlie Parkins. I'll be starting us off, and then you'll be hearing from Nicholas Hebert a little bit later on in the presentation, so welcome. The agenda for the presentation today is just to go over the SRF process from a 30,000-foot view, kind of from beginning to end. Then I'm going to show you some screenshots of the actual loan application, discuss some of the differences between if you're getting SRF and ARPA. I'll also discuss some of the deadlines, particularly the ARPA deadlines, and then we'll shift down to some of the SRF outstanding items, what's the difference between SRF and ARPA, and then, like I said, we'll have Q&A at the end. So to just start it off, last January, everybody submitted a letter of interest. We take those letters of interest and we rank them from severe issues all the way down to minor issues. The severe issues ranking towards the top, getting the funds. Unfortunately, we don't have a bottomless bucket of money, so we're not able to fund all the projects. So the ones that rank the highest are typically the ones that get the funding. If systems opt out, then we're able to work down that list. But that's the first step. From there, you will get a notification or a letter letting you know that it's time to actually submit an application for those funds. Once we receive that application, we will review it to make sure it lines up with the letter of interest. The regional engineers will review the engineering agreement just to make sure it lines up with what was in the letter of interest. Once we have everything we need, we'll actually draft up a loan contract and send it out to the systems. When I draft up those loans, it will already be signed by the director of DEQ. So once the system gets it, then it's a legally binding contract, and so that's when all the costs can start to be incurred. And then as the project is going about, you'll be getting invoiced from the consulting engineer. The system will fill out reimbursement request forms and submit those to DEQ for payment until the end. We will close out the loan and then put the system into repayment, which starts 6 months after the loan is closed. So the SRF application, I'm not going to go through this line by line. I just wanted you to be able to identify what it looks like. The section 1 is the background information. This is pretty straightforward, just name, addresses, phone numbers, emails, all that kind of stuff. The biggest thing on this is just making sure everything is current and up to date. That way, when we're sending out, contracts or information, it's going to correct email addresses or physical addresses. If we need to call somebody, it's easy just to pull up the loan application and get contact information. So that's probably the biggest thing on section 1, is just making sure everything is current and up to date. Next section is section 2. This is going to be the budget information. You'll put in, the total project cost, how much you're getting from DEQ, if you're getting funding from other sources, all that kind of stuff. We are going to allow phasing on the ARPA funded projects. This is a little different than what we thought a few months ago. So if you're going to be phasing the project, you'll fill out some additional information, particularly items number 4. You'll go through that and submit kind of an idea, or not an idea, but like an MOU of what the system plans on doing as far as funding. An example would be if you're doing both treatment and distribution, you're going to fund treatment with the ARPA money, and then maybe you're going to do distribution a little bit later on with maybe SRF funding or funding from another source. But we are going to allow phasing for the ARPA funding Granted, it does need to make sense for the project. If you put it in the LOI, that will be kind of a good clue that you intended to phase the project, but that's something that we're going to allow. You'll also notice number 8, there's some red ink. If you are just applying for the ARPA funding, then you won't need to be filling out those sections that have the red ink or the notification next to it. For the most part, a lot of the application, whether you're getting SRF or ARPA, you'll need to fill out. So there is just a few items where if you're getting ARPA, you won't need to fill it out, and those will be highlighted in the red next to it. Section 3, this is just kind of a breakdown of what the project is, how much is going towards treatment, storage, the source. We're not too particular and being exact down to the penny or down to the dollar, but if you can break that out for us, we I guess fortunately, unfortunately, depending on your perspective, have to report all this information back to the EPA. So if you're able to put that information in there, it just avoids us having to call either the consulting engineer or calling the system and say, hey, of this, $5 million project, how much is going towards these different sections? So if you can, fill that out to the best of your ability. That way we can report that back to the EPA, and it just avoids back and forth between myself and the system. Section 4 is the policies and financials. Again, if you're just doing ARPA, we're not requiring 3 years of audited financials. We would like to see like a balance sheet if you're just going for ARPA, since this is just grant funds, you're not paying us back, but we would like to see that you're at least have a balance sheet or some kind of budget going on. Again, that's just for the ARPA funding. The remainder of the policies and financials will apply if you're getting SRF, but for the ARPA funding, we don't need the 3 years of audited financials, and I think the other one was the rate. I can't remember which it is, but this is just the section 4 and 5, and then section 5 is just signing the application and submitting it. Some of the key deadlines for the ARPA funding, September 2nd, just to notify me that you're going to be moving forward with receiving the ARPA funding. Sometimes from 7 months ago, things change, and if you don't need the ARPA funding, then we need to know that as soon as possible so we can take those funds and redistribute it to somebody that does need it. Just an email or a phone call saying, hey, yeah, we plan on using the funds, or no, we don't need it, we got funding from somewhere else. That's all that suffices for that September 2nd deadline. So just let me know so that we can track those funds and give them to the next system if we need to do that. October 31st is another key deadline. If you don't have an approved facility plan, you'll need to get that submitted to the regional engineers so they have time to review it and approve it. December 30th is the date to actually get that ARPA application into me. You'll need to obtain the ability to incur debt. The caveat there is kind of that phasing thing I was referencing. If you plan on phasing, just using ARPA for the first phase, and maybe you'll be getting funding later on at another date to do the other phase. Again, it does need to make sense for the project. But if you plan on doing the entire thing, we don't need to know exactly who the funds are coming from, but just let us know that you've passed the bond or you've gotten judicial confirmation, but that does need to be done by the end of the calendar year. And that planning document that you submitted by October 31st, that does need to be approved by the end of the calendar year. Again, that's just so that we can meet the deadlines that the Treasury has set forth for us, and so we can get these funds into the ground and used up by the end of the deadline. So they're kind of tight deadlines, but we feel that they're manageable. The SRF only application, those aren't due until the end of March. So if you're just getting SRF, if you're on our IUP for funding and you're not getting any ARPA, the application for those will be due at the end of March. Another thing that I kind of wanted to point out, the federal government is moving away from DUNS numbers to UEI numbers. and the systems that are receiving funding from us will need to be registered in SAN.gov. If you have a DUNS number, according to the federal government, they have already issued you a UEI, so there won't be any kind of process other than retrieving the UEI, but we will need that. If you're not registered, we're going to ask that you do register. That's a requirement going forward for the funding. I also want to do a quick plug for our handbook. It was recently updated. It used to be divided into both drinking water and wastewater and grant and loan handbooks. We had 4 different handbooks. It's been consolidated down to one. The applications and all the existing forms are in the handbook. And so for the consulting engineers, if you're used to the forms, 5A, 5B, 5C, that kind of stuff, you might want to check our handbook as it has been updated. And hopefully a little clearer and a little more user-friendly. And now I'll turn it over to Nicholas to discuss a little bit more in detail about, what ARPA needs and what we don't need for the ARPA projects. Nicholas, I will turn it over to you.
All righty, thanks, Charlie. So one of the things that we're getting a lot of questions on is, what are the different requirements between an ARPA only project or say an SRF project or even a SRF hybrid ARPA project. And so in that very first section, as Charlie alluded to, there's a checkbox for what kind of funding you're eligible for, what kind of funding you're applying for. I anticipate a lot of you folks will be checking that ARPA box, along with some folks that will be checking the SRF box. And so, again, if you have questions on what you're applying for, reach out to Charlie or myself. You can also circle back and review where you are on the intended use plan or the ARPA priority list. Those are available on our website. And as Charlie also mentioned, you should have received a letter specifically stating what your system is eligible for. So make sure you get those 2 check boxes right on the application. That's really important as far as, are you applying for ARPA, just SRF, or both ARPA and SRF. So there won't be 2 applications for ARPA and SRF. This is one application. So along with that, if you're only applying for ARPA projects, so you have no SRF money combining with this ARPA, there's a few things that are not required, which is, I think, probably good news for everyone. The first thing is there's no environmental review required for ARPA only funding. Now, the caveat with the no environmental review is we are available. DEQ staff is available to do an environmental review on these projects. That's something that it may be prudent depending on what your project looks like. If you maybe are anticipating, wanting to have the flexibility or the freedom to find other funding sources potentially down the road for this project, whether that's SRF or rural development or Army Corps, those funding sources do require environmental review. And so if you anticipate at any point down the road you would be bringing on additional funding sources that do require an environmental review, sometimes it's easiest just to get it done here and now. Our staff have been able to streamline the environmental review process, and it's typically pretty quick and pretty painless. And so it's certainly something that we can support for these ARPA only projects if you want to do that as kind of a contingency. And so that's a decision you can make. We're available to work with you on that. However, for ARPA only, it is not a requirement for environmental review. Probably some of the best news is no domestic preference is going to be required for ARPA only funds. So that's no American Iron and Steel, no Build America, Buy America requirements. Again, this is just for the ARPA only funds. And so in other words, if you do co-fund a project that has these requirements, those requirements will govern. So in other words, if you have an SRF, if you have a project that has both SRF funding and ARPA funding, that SRF funding is going to require, American Iron Steel, certainly, and potentially Build America, Buy America requirements. And so, again, it's really important that you understand what kind of funding you do have to be able to navigate this. But this is great news for ARPA only projects. No American Iron Steel, no Build America, Buy America, period. And so we won't have to cross those bridges. The last thing that's not required for ARPA only is the DBE, the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Utilization. That's not going to be required on ARPA only projects either. So a few things that aren't required, which then takes us to kind of the question of, well, the next slide of what is required for ARPA. One of the answers is any typical federal requirements for construction. Federal funding construction is going to still will be required. So an example would be the equal opportunity requirements that contractors are required to follow. These are pretty standard construction requirements that are found in 2 CFR Part 200 in Appendix 2. Those requirements are already wrapped into our specification inserts for both SRF, and a couple bullet points down there. We have developed an ARPA only specification insert, and all those requirements are wrapped into that specification insert that will be passed on to the bidding documents and the contractor. And so again, you don't have to search for these things. They're in the specification inserts that will go into these projects. And again, pretty typical stuff, really no surprises there. One of the surprises or the differences in that list is Davis-Bacon wages are not required. However, super helpful, Department of Treasury did require that prevailing wages be paid for these ARPA projects. And so this has been something we've had a lot of discussion internally and externally. Idaho does not have prevailing wages, and so this has been kind of a challenge for us on how we prove that to the Department of Treasury, because DEQ is going to be required, as Charlie mentioned, to go back and document and report some of these requirements back to Treasury. So where it sits right now, kind of our path forward, at least for right now, is that we're going to ask the recipients during the bidding phase to basically tell DEQ how you're going to satisfy prevailing wages. The slam dunk home run would be just to use Davis-Bacon. Most contractors are familiar with Davis-Bacon. DEQ is familiar with Davis-Bacon. It checks the box for Treasury. That would be a very easy way to document and implement prevailing wages into ARPA projects. However, for whatever reason, if that is not the direction that recipients want to take, we will allow recipients to put together a wage report, which essentially is going to document how prevailing wages are being satisfied on these projects, which is basically going to be very Davis-Bacon-like requirements. And so it kind of goes back to that. You have some flexibility and freedom on how you're going to do that. Although, our recommendation at least would be just to use Davis-Bacon, because it's a known system and everybody knows how to navigate it, and it's time tested. So one kind of nuance there with ARPA is this prevailing wages requirement. I already mentioned the next bullet point, the ARPA only specification insert, which is going to encapsulate all those things that do require for these ARPA projects. And that ARPA only specification insert, it will be attached to the grant, ARPA grant contract that Charlie mentioned. And so if you're wondering where to find that, if your consultant's wondering where to find that, because it is going to be required to be part of the bidding documents and the contract documents for construction. If you're wondering where that is, go back to the grant, the ARPA grant offer, and that specification insert is going to be included as an attachment. You can grab it, photocopy it, stick it in the plans and specs. If for some reason you can't find that, please reach out to myself or your regional engineering contact, and we can get that to you. Last but not least, we do anticipate. Let's see if we can go back one slide. We got one more bullet item. We do anticipate some monthly reporting for ARPA only projects. Primarily, the need here is DEQ again has to report back to Treasury on the status of these projects and expenditures and where these projects are at and how they're meeting the deadlines and moving forward to meet deadlines. And so, at least initially, what we're anticipating is there's going to be some kind of monthly reporting. What we anticipate would be that this would be maybe a template or a standardized form that would be attached to a reimbursement request. And so as the system, as you're starting to draw funds from the ARPA, you and your consultant will be filling out a reimbursement request almost identical to the SRF processes. But as part of ARPA, we'd anticipate maybe a one-page sheet behind that gives us a little bit more clear picture of where the ARPA project and where the ARPA funds are at and how deadlines are being met. And so that'll give us the ability to meet our reporting requirements without having to bug you and your consultant every month with seemingly useless information or requests for information. So with that, next slide, one of the questions we're getting pretty common is this cost overrun question for existing SRF loans. And so as part of the ARPA priority list, we also looked at existing SRF loans from last year that had known cost overruns on an existing loan. And so we allocated some ARPA funding to those systems. The first, I believe, 12 ARPA systems slated to receive ARPA on that list were for cost overruns. And so these systems, if you're on that list, the first 12, you're not required to fill out a loan funding application. And so everything that Charlie went through, just go ahead and disregard it altogether for right now. And what we're asking for those systems with cost overruns, existing loans, we're asking you just to submit a written request, specifically addressing 4 items. Just kind of the why and the where and how and the when. We need to know what happened. We need justification for the costs, an updated budget, and kind of strategies to make it across the finish line. And so this is different again than the new ARPA projects where we are requesting that you submit a funding application. These are specifically for existing SRF loans that were on that list, the priority list, for cost overruns. And you can submit that written request to myself. And if you have any questions on what needs to be included in that, or any questions on how to do that, you're certainly welcome to reach out to me directly, and we can kind of walk through some of that. The deadline to submit that is September 2nd, and so if we don't hear from you by September 2nd, certainly we'll probably be reaching out to verify, but ultimately, if you're not interested in those cost overrun ARPA dollars, we will be moving down the list, so to speak, after September 2nd. We're also getting a lot of questions about cost overruns or anticipated cost overruns for maybe projects that haven't started or projects that don't have an existing SRF loan. Maybe for some of these ARPA only projects, we're getting questions of, we already know that costs are going to come in over budget just because of the construction industry, what we're seeing in the construction industry right now. So in that context, I guess we would ask, just keep us informed, keep us updated. Let us know what you're seeing specific to your project. We do anticipate that, as much as we can, we want to help, but we won't be able to help everybody. I mean, the ARPA funding is limited, and so we have to prioritize projects that have bids that are in construction that have change orders that we have to try to get those people across the finish line first. However, please over communicate with us. Please let us know what you're seeing. If you're seeing engineers' opinions of cost, much more than the project budget that you have, it would be prudent to communicate that to us. And if we can help, we certainly will. Like I said, there's a lot of demand for this ARPA money right now, and so we're doing our best to try to channel that money to the highest need and to the most amount of people as possible at the same time, which is certainly easier said than done. So with all of that, kind of a little bit of a rabbit hole with ARPA to run down. We'll pop up out of the hole and just see if anybody has any questions, and if there's anything we didn't address, we'd be happy to take a stab at. All right, I'm seeing a question here I'll take a stab at for cost underruns. So in other words, a cost estimate. The example here was 600,000 that came in at, the bids came in at 200,000. So that's certainly good news. To be honest with you, it's the first I've heard of it in a couple of years now of engineering construction costs coming under the engineering opinion of cost. So that's great news. We can certainly work with systems that have cost underruns. So in other words, excess of project funds. Our thought would be, if we can, would be to free up those funds to move down the list, much in the same way, much like a bypass of systems that aren't ready. We would move down the list with those funds. But I think it's going to be a little bit case by case, and so we'll probably have to circle up with those systems, those few. I'm anticipating few systems where that does happen, and come up with a bit of a plan on how to get that ARPA money to you in the amount that you need it with appropriate contingency to move through construction. And so that would be the first thing, and then also just making sure that this is looking at the holistic project for that was requested in the LOI, not just a phase or a portion of the project. So that would be my stab at that first question.
Nicholas, this is Mariana. I have to concur with you on that. And definitely for that question, it was just one specific item. And we definitely want to look at the whole project and knowing there will be cost overruns on other items in that project. We're still going to look to award that full ARPA amount, and then just keep in touch with you throughout the whole project.
I see the question on the cost of consultant preparing the ARPA application reimbursable. Yes. Brent, can you further clarify phasing for a project covered at 50%? Was it stated that ARPA would cover the system could seek additional funding to cover the rest of the project in a later phase? So Brent, yeah, if you have a project that makes sense to phase and you're able to do that first phase with the ARPA funding, just submit to, like Nicholas stated, just submit kind of a plan of how you plan on phasing the second part, kind of a, when and preferably how the funding and all that kind of stuff. Maybe it's next year, 2 years, a few years down the road. So yeah, that's kind of a change from what we initially thought. If systems can make it work and it makes sense to phase it, you're able to use the ARPA funding for phase one, and then finish out the other phases at a later date.
And Charlie, this is Nicholas. I'll just add to that. It has to Brent's question, to phase it, it really has to make sense technically and operationally. In other words, we really want you to show us how it's going to work technically and operationally. It has to make sense to phase the project. And so just chopping projects up to fit the ARPA budget probably isn't going to fit that criteria. And so we're going to be looking at that pretty closely to make sure it makes sense. And, obviously relying on the consultant's professional judgment to make sure that phasing plan really works. And in the ARPA, the funding application, there's some very specific questions that we ask in regards to a phasing plan, that if you can take a look at those and use those questions to build that phasing plan, I think the rest will kind of flesh itself out.
This is Gary Carroll. I also think that any phasing should be addressed in a facility plan if you're going to be doing that with a capital improvement plan and stuff like that. I think the DEQ regional engineers will be looking for that in facility plans.
Yep, that's a great point, Gary, and I appreciate that input. Brent followed up the question as well with, will the system need a legal authority to incur debt by the end of the year? Again, the answer is yes, unless that phasing plan can identify how the project will be phased out over time. In that case, the answer would be not yet. We can push that requirement out in accordance with a phasing plan that's submitted with the.
Again, let us know if you're going to be using the funding. If not, we would like to know that information too. If you're still needing to get your facility plan approved, please get those submitted so the regional engineers have time to review those. If you need to get the ability to incur debt, I would encourage you to start on that path or get judicial confirmation, whichever route your system is looking forward to go. Like we said, it's possible that systems might not need the funding, so we'll be able to either move down or maybe redistribute. So I would advise systems to at least put themselves in a position to receive funding should we be able to move down.
Hi, Charlie. This is Randy Baroche with Rune Yeager and Associates. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Real quick question for you. On the funding list, if an entity is below the funding cutoff that was on the approved list, are you expecting those folks to submit an application just in the event that they can get funded?
I'm gonna say no, just because based on what we're hearing, there's it's more common to see cost overruns than underruns. So the likelihood of us moving down is probably kind of slim, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. So I don't want to put a system through the process of, submitting an application and getting your financials and all that stuff, situated and submitted until we know that we can offer the system funding. So I would table the submitting the application until you're informed that we can fund the system. Brent, one more question. Is technical or final approval required by the end of the year? So yeah, facility plans need to be approved by the end of the calendar year if you're still in that process.
I'll jump in on that one a little bit, Charlie. Specifically, we're looking for technical approval. Final approval would be great if you can push for that, but the deadline itself is for the technical approval, the final of the facility plan. Assuming again that the alternative has basically been developed and selected, and we have a refined project scope and budget to move forward with a ARPA application.
Also, if you have, specific questions to your system that you think it could turn into a rabbit hole, definitely reach out to Nicholas, myself, the regional engineers. We might have to do just kind of a one-on-one with those systems. But other than that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Again, if you want to rewatch it, it's going to be posted on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. Or reach out to us by email, and we will be happy to, set up a conference call or a Teams call with those systems and discuss something in depth if we need to do that. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.